In August 19, 71 foreign governments held roughly $50 billion in claims on the United States. America had about $10 billion in gold behind them. Most people are taught that Richard Nixon took America off the gold standard, that he did it in a television address on a Sunday evening, and that the dollar has been backed by nothing ever since. The outline of that is correct. Almost everything underneath it is not, and the part that is wrong is the part that still governs the price of everything you buy. The gold standard, the textbooks describe, had already stopped functioning years before Nixon spoke. What ended that Sunday was the last legal fiction holding it upright. And it was not decided by a country. It was decided by 15 men in a lodge in the Maryland woods across a single weekend with the telephones cut off so nobody could leak. Congress never voted on the suspension itself. The Secretary of State was not told it was happening. I want to invert the usual causation here. Nixon did not break the system built at Bretton Woods. That system was assembled in 1944 with a flaw inside it that guaranteed this ending. The flaw was described in public 11 years before the ending arrived by an economist nobody wanted to hear, and by 1971, the only remaining question was who would be standing at the door when it came off its hinges. Let me say that again, because it matters. On this reading, and it is a reading shared by a great many economists, but not by all of them, the collapse of 1971 was not a policy failure. It was a design failure running on a very long delay. I will give you the serious case against that later, because there is one. 3 things worth waiting for. 8 central banks that spent 7 years quietly selling their own gold to defend a price all of them knew was false. A president recorded on his own tape system telling his own central banker how much money he wanted created and in which months he wanted it created. And an economist who warned Washington the machine would break was proved right in every particular, and then quietly gave up on America and went home to help build the thing that replaced it. So let's go back. Not to 1971, but to the summer of 1944, and a hotel in the mountains of New Hampshire. 730 delegates from 44 countries met at Bretton Woods while the war was still being fought to decide what money would be after it ended. Everyone in the room agreed on the problem. Between the wars, countries had devalued against each other in sequence, thrown up tariffs, and strangled trade, and the wreckage had helped produce the thing they were currently fighting. 2 men arrived with solutions. John Maynard Keynes, representing a bankrupt Britain, proposed an artificial international reserve unit he called Bancor, issued by a clearing union that would penalize surplus countries as well as deficit ones. Harry Dexter White, representing a United States that at that moment held something in the order of 2/3 of the world's monetary gold, proposed a system anchored to the dollar. White won, for the reason that people with the gold usually win. There is a postscript to that man worth 30 seconds. Harry Dexter White went from Bretton Woods to the International Monetary Fund, resigned abruptly in 1947 after the Attorney General ordered a grand jury investigation into him, and in August 1948 denied before a congressional committee that he had ever been a communist. He had a heart attack immediately afterwards and died 3 days later at 55. Decades on, the decrypted Soviet cable traffic known as Venona identified him under code names as a source, and what that amounts to is still argued over by Robert Skidelsky, Bruce Craig, and Ben Stile, who have read the same files and reached different verdicts. None of that is why Bretton Woods failed, and I do not want to imply that it is. The design would have broken on its own arithmetic, whoever drafted it. It is simply an irony worth knowing that the financial order of the Western world was drawn up in large part by a Treasury official. His own government was still investigating 3 years later. The design that came out of it was elegant and, on paper, simple. The dollar was fixed to gold at $35 an ounce. Every other currency was fixed to the dollar. Foreign central banks could bring their dollars to the United States Treasury and exchange them for metal at that rate, which was what made the promise real rather than rhetorical. Notice what that arrangement actually asks of one country. The world needs a growing supply of reserves because world trade grows. Under this design, the only way the world gets more reserves is for the United States to send more dollars abroad than it takes back, which means running a deficit, permanently. And every dollar sent abroad is a claim on a stock of gold that does not grow because gold comes out of the ground at whatever rate the mines manage and no faster. Hold those 2 sentences next to each other and you have the whole story. The system required America to issue claims faster than it could ever cover them. It was not a system with a risk of failure. It was a system with a scheduled one, somebody noticed. In 1960, a Belgian-born economist at Yale named Robert Triffin published a book called Gold and the Dollar Crisis and was called before Congress to explain it. Triffin was not a fringe figure and not an ideologue. He had worked at the Federal Reserve and at the International Monetary Fund. He had taken American citizenship in 1942 when the country he had emigrated to went to war. He was, by every account, a mild man who liked to be useful. What he told Congress was that the arrangement contained a contradiction that no amount of good management could resolve. If the United States stopped running deficits, world trade would starve for want of reserves. If it kept running them, the pile of foreign-held dollars would eventually exceed the American gold stock, and the moment enough people worked that out, the promise to convert would become unenforceable, and everyone would try to be first through the door. Confidence and liquidity, he said, could not both be supplied by the same instrument indefinitely. You could have one for a while by sacrificing the other. You could not have both forever. That argument is now taught in every course on international economics under his name. At the time it was received, the way inconvenient arithmetic usually is. Officials conceded the logic and deferred the conclusion. The system was working, trade was booming, Europe was rebuilding, nothing was on fire. And here is where the story gets strange, because the numbers moved exactly as he said they would in public, on a published schedule, for a decade, and nothing was done. By 1959, American gold reserves and total external dollar liabilities were roughly equal. By 1964, the dollars held by foreign monetary authorities alone had passed the value of the entire United States gold stock. By the late 1960s, the gap was not close. Foreign dollar holdings stood near $50 billion. American gold stood near 10. Translate that. For every $5 of foreign claims, the vault held $1 of metal. Every central banker in the world could read the figures because the Treasury published them. The other half of the story is not a design flaw at all, and I want to be fair to the people who make this argument, because the economist Michael Bordo has made it forcefully, and I think he is substantially right. The system did not only die of its birth defect, it was also killed. From the middle of the 1960s, the United States chose to fight a war in Vietnam and expand a large domestic program at the same time, and chose not to raise taxes far enough to pay for either. The gap was covered by borrowing and by money creation. American inflation, which had run near 1% in the early 60s, was above 4% by 1968 and climbing. A country that anchors the world's money to metal has agreed to a discipline. It has agreed to keep its own prices stable, because if its prices rise while its currency is fixed to gold, that currency becomes overvalued, and everyone holding it can see that they are holding something worth less than the promise printed on it. The United States broke that discipline while continuing to insist the promise held. They were not stupid. They were choosing. Every one of those decisions was defensible on its own terms and lethal in combination. Now, this next part is the piece most people have never heard, and it is the moment the price stopped being a real price. By 1960, the free market price of gold in London had started drifting above $35, which is what happens when the world quietly stops believing a number. So in 1961, 8 central banks, led by the United States and including Britain, Germany, France, Italy, Switzerland, Belgium, and the Netherlands, formed what was called the London Gold Pool. The arrangement was straightforward and almost never discussed in public. When the London price rose above 35, the pool sold gold into the market to push it back down. When it fell below, the pool bought. The members shared the cost by an agreed formula, with the Americans carrying the largest share. Read that again slowly. In order to maintain the official price of gold, 8 governments were selling their own gold. They were spending the reserve to defend the number attached to the reserve. France worked out the futility of this earlier than the others and withdrew in 1967, having already begun converting dollars into metal on its own account. Then in November 1967, Britain devalued sterling. The market concluded correctly that the dollar was next in the queue, and buying became a stampede. In the middle of March, 1968, the pool gave up. It had shipped an enormous quantity of gold into the market in a matter of days, and stopped the price for less than a fortnight. The London gold market was closed for 2 weeks. Officials from the participating countries met in Washington over a weekend to decide what to do next, which is a rehearsal 3 years early for the weekend this video is about. The same instinct both times. Shut the market, gather a small number of men, decide, announce on a Monday. What replaced it was a 2-tier arrangement. Central banks would go on trading with each other at $35. Everyone else would trade at whatever the market said, which is a formal announcement made by the people running the system that the official price and the real price were now 2 different numbers. That was March 1968. 3.5 years before Nixon spoke, the gold standard had already been reduced to an accounting convention between governments. The French had a phrase for what the arrangement gave America, and it is worth pausing on it because it is almost always credited to the wrong man. The phrase is exorbitant privilege, and Charles de Gaulle did not coin it. It came from his finance minister, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, who later became president of France. The complaint behind the phrase was precise. The United States could pay for foreign goods, foreign factories, and foreign wars with paper it printed itself. Barry Eichengreen put the arithmetic at its bluntest. It costs a few cents to produce a $100 bill, and a foreign country has to hand over $100 of real goods to get one. De Gaulle's economic advisor, Jacques Rueff, argued the point at length through the 1960s, and France acted on it, presenting dollars for gold and shipping the metal home. There is a version of this told as pure Gaullist theater. That is unfair to the analysis. Rueff's objection was that a reserve system, in which the reserve is another country's liability, lets that country escape the adjustment every other country is forced to make, and there is nothing hysterical about that objection. It is the same point Triffin made, arriving from the opposite direction. Which brings us to the weekend. By the summer of 1971, the position was untenable, and everybody involved knew it. In the second quarter, the United States recorded its first trade deficit in the 20th century, which sounds like a technicality, and was in fact the end of the last argument for the peg. The country whose currency the world held because that country sold the world more than it bought had stopped selling the world more than it bought. In May, Germany gave up trying to hold its rate and let the mark float, and several other European currencies came under the same pressure within days. Through the first fortnight of August, the outflow accelerated. Foreign central banks were not speculating against the dollar for profit. They were doing the arithmetic every treasury does when a counterparty's liabilities exceed its assets, which is working out where they stand in the queue. On Friday, the 13th of August, Nixon and roughly 15 advisors helicoptered to Camp David. The list matters because of who is on it and who is not. Treasury Secretary John Connally, Budget Director George Shultz, Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, Undersecretary for Monetary Affairs Paul Volcker, the economists Herbert Stein and Paul McCracken, Peter Peterson, the speechwriter William Safire, Haldeman and Ehrlichman, nobody from the State Department, nobody from the National Security Council. The men responsible for America's relationships with the countries about to be on the receiving end of this did not know the meeting was taking place. Over roughly 48 hours, they agreed a package. Convertibility of the dollar into gold was suspended. A 10% surcharge was slapped on dutiable imports. Wages and prices across the entire American economy were frozen for 90 days. Foreign aid was cut by 10%. Arthur Burns argued against closing the gold window. He thought it was unnecessary, and that the damage abroad would exceed the benefit at home. He lost the argument to Connally, who wanted the surcharge as a crowbar to force other countries to revalue their currencies upward, and who is remembered for a line he supposedly delivered to European finance ministers a few months later, that the dollar was America's currency but their problem. The line is an anecdote rather than a transcript, and I would treat it as such. What is in the documents is blunter. Connally told the meeting that foreigners were out to take advantage of the United States and that the American job was to get there first. Now, hold on to the thing that makes this a story about power rather than economics. Suspending gold convertibility required no legislation, because the promise had never been a statute owed to the American public. It was an operating practice of the Treasury toward foreign central banks. The president could simply instruct it to stop. The wage and price freeze did have a legal basis, and this is the detail I find hardest to get past. The authority came from the Economic Stabilization Act, which a Democratic Congress had handed Nixon in 1,970 inches, the expectation that he would never dare use it as a way of making him wear the blame for inflation. He used it. Executive Order 11615 froze the wages and prices of 200 million people, and it was signed on a Sunday. The announcement went out at 9 in the evening on the 15th of August, preempting the most popular program on American television. The domestic reaction was not outrage. It was relief and then approval. The stock market had its largest single-day gain in its history to that point when it opened on Monday, which points at what this actually was. The freeze was the part the public could feel, and it was popular, and it made the part they could not feel go down without a fight. Because the calendar matters. The presidential election was 15 months away, and Nixon had watched a recession help cost him the presidency in 1960 and did not intend to repeat it. The tapes are the uncomfortable part. The economist Burton Abrams went through the Nixon recordings and published what is on them. In October 1971, Nixon told Burns he did not want to leave office. In February 1972, he told him, more or less in plain words, that what the Federal Reserve did after April did not much concern him, but what it did between then and April could hurt in November. The money supply grew rapidly through 1,972. The federal funds rate fell by more than 4 percentage points. Nixon won 49 states. Abrams is careful, and I will be too. He notes that Burns may have reached the same policy on his own reasoning, since Burns genuinely believed wage and price controls would hold inflation down and that 6% unemployment showed slack. That defense is available and cannot be disproved. Abrams's reply is the one I would make. It is hard to believe the outcome would have been identical without the pressure. Consumer prices rose 9.6% in 1973 and 11.8% in 1974. There is one more act, and leaving it out is how the story gets told wrong. The suspension in August was announced as temporary. In December 1971, the 10 leading industrial countries met at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington and produced what looked like a repair. The dollar was devalued against gold from $35 an ounce to $38. Other currencies were revalued upward. The permitted band of fluctuation was widened to 2.25% either side. The import surcharge was withdrawn on the 20th of December, having done its work as a crowbar. What the agreement did not do was restore convertibility. The new gold price was a number with no window behind it. Nixon announced the result as the most significant monetary agreement in the history of the world. It lasted 14 months. Through 1,972 speculation pushed currencies to the edges of their new bands. The central banks took in dollars they did not want, and the London gold price climbed towards $90, while the official price sat at $38. In February 1973, the United States devalued another 10%. Within weeks, the major currencies were floating, and they have been floating ever since. So, the honest date for the end of Bretton Woods is March 1973, not August 1971. What August 1971 did was make March 1973 arithmetic rather than a decision. That is the historian's quarrel in miniature, and it is worth setting out properly, because it is a real argument between serious people and not a settled question. Triffin's camp says the system was doomed by construction, and 1971 was merely when the actuarial table caught up. Against that stand, Emile Desprez, Charles Kindleberger, and William Salant, who argued in 1966 that everyone had misread the account. The United States, they said, was functioning as the world's bank, taking in short-term deposits and making long-term loans, and a bank's short-term liabilities exceeding its liquid reserves is not insolvency. It is banking. On their reading, the deficits were demand-determined. Foreigners wanted the dollars, and the arrangement could have run indefinitely if governments had stopped panicking. Bordeaux's answer, which is roughly where the profession has settled, is that the design flaw was real but slow, and that what turned a slow problem into a fast one was American monetary policy after 1965. The house had a crack in the foundation. Somebody also drove into it. Now I have to deal with a story you will meet everywhere if you go looking, because this is precisely where credibility is lost. The story is that on Friday, the 13th of August, 1971, the British government demanded $3 billion in American gold, and that this demand is what panicked Washington into closing the window that weekend. It appears in article after article as the smoking gun. There was a British approach that day. But the economic historian Douglas Irwin went back through the record, and what the British actually asked for was cover for part of their dollar holdings, meaning a guarantee against loss, not a truckload of metal. The request was garbled as it passed through the American system, which is how $3 billion of gold entered the folklore. And Paul Volcker, who was in the room, was explicit that it did not trigger the closing of the gold window, because the meeting to make that decision had already been arranged the day before. I am spelling this out, because the difference matters. If a British telex broke Bretton Woods, then this is a story about an accident. It was not an accident. It was a scheduled demolition, and the schedule had been legible for 11 years. Now, let me bring all of these threads together, because no single one of these decisions produces the world we currently live in. A reserve asset that was one country's liability, adopted in 1944, because that country held the gold and could therefore write the rules, carrying a contradiction that was published under a named economist's signature in 1960, and then filed. A decade in which the United States broke the price discipline the anchor depended on, financing a war and a domestic expansion without the taxes to match, while 8 central banks sold their own gold to defend a number. None of them believed and conceded in 1968 that there were now 2 prices, and an American president 15 months from an election holding an instrument his opponents had handed him, assuming he would never dare use it. Take any one of those alone and you have a difficult year. Put them in that order, and you have the end of a monetary era arriving on a Sunday with a wage freeze wrapped around it so it would poll well. There is a group in this story who never appear in the account of it, and they were the ones who paid. Be clear about what an ordinary American actually lost, because it was not the right to walk into a bank with paper and walk out with metal. That had been taken away in the 1930s. What existed in 1971 was an external check, Foreign central banks could still present dollars and demand gold, and that standing threat was the last thing outside the American government's own discretion that put any limit on the value of a pay packet. After that Sunday, there was no such limit at all. What arrived instead was a decade in which prices roughly doubled. The gold window was not the sole author of that, and I want to say so plainly. Monetary policy, the deficits, the removal of the price controls and stages, and 2 oil shocks all did work. But the external check went first, and it went without anyone being asked. Wages chased them and lost. A person who had spent 30 years accumulating a fixed pension found that the number was intact, and the thing it bought was not. Think about what that looks like from inside a household. Nothing is taken, no account is emptied, and no notice arrives. The figure on the statement is exactly what it was last year, and the shop has quietly moved. There is nobody to appeal to, because on paper nothing has happened. That is not a metaphor. It is what the decade did to a specific generation of savers, and no vote was ever held on it. And I want to be careful here, because the argument that gold would have prevented this is weaker than it sounds. The gold standard had its own history of forcing brutal deflation onto working people to defend a price. The choice in 1971 was not between discipline and chaos. It was between 2 different ways of imposing costs, and the second way had the advantage of being harder to see. So what remains of this now, more than 50 years later? The Triffin tension did not go away with the gold. It changed clothes. The world still runs on one country's currency, still accumulates that country's debt as its reserve asset, and still depends on that country supplying more of the asset than its own economy strictly needs. The constraint that used to be a vault of metal is now a judgment about credibility, and a judgment can be revised much faster than a vault can be emptied. You can see the shape of the old problem in the newer arguments about reserves. Every large holder of dollar assets faces the same 2-sided position the French faced. The asset is useful, and the asset is somebody else's promise. Central banks have been buying gold again at the fastest rate in decades, which is not a prediction of collapse, and is quite plainly a hedge against exactly that ambiguity. The metal never came back as money. It came back as a second opinion. The other pattern is procedural, and it is the one I would carry out of this. The most consequential monetary decision of the 20th century was taken by a small group over a weekend, using authority that had been granted for something else and announced before anyone affected could organize a response. It was not illegal. That is rather the point. The instrument was chosen because it was fast and because it required nobody's consent. The next time someone tells you that Nixon took America off the gold standard in 1971, you will know better. The link to gold had been failing since at least 1960, and the market price had been formally cut loose in 1968. What happened in 1971 was not the beginning of the collapse. It was the moment the United States stopped honoring the last official promise, holding the system together, and that promise was real right up until it was withdrawn. Foreign central banks could convert on the Friday, they could not on the Monday. The thing worth remembering is not that a president closed a window, but that by the time he closed it, everybody who could read a balance sheet had known for over a decade that the room behind it was nearly empty. Robert Triffin lived to see all of it. He watched the system he had diagnosed come apart on the timetable he had described, and he received, for being right, no particular vindication. In 1977, he went back to Belgium, the country he had left in 1935, and regained the citizenship he had given up in 1942 to become an American. He spent his last years at Louvain-la-Neuve working on European Monetary Union, on the design of the currency unit that would become the euro. The man who had explained why one nation's money could not safely serve as everyone's reserve spent his final working decade helping build an alternative to it. He died in February 1993, a few months after the Maastricht Treaty was signed, and the gold window itself has no monument. There is no plaque at Camp David and no anniversary anybody marks. It exists as a 20-minute television address, a numbered executive order, and a weekend guest list of 15 names, most of which the people living in the world it made have never heard. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe. And tell me which one you would put first. The flaw designed into Bretton Woods in 1944, the 8 central banks burning their own reserves through the 1960s, or the election calendar sitting on the table at Camp David. I read every single one,